Imagine a freezing night in Boston. Snow falling, lanterns flickering, voices rising in anger. A crowd gathers, armed with nothing but courage, rocks, and snowballs. Facing them, British soldiers, muskets loaded, bayonets gleaming. In the chaos, one shot is fired, then another, until the street is soaked with blood. This was no ordinary street fight. This was the spark that lit the American Revolution. Boston, 1770. The cobblestone streets echo with the sound of wagon wheels, horse hooves, and the restless chatter of colonists who feel the weight of something heavy pressing down on them. Not just the chill of a New England winter, but the burden of taxes that no one in the colonies had ever agreed to. The British Crown had been tightening its grip. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the taxes on paper, glass, paint, and most of all, tea. Each new law felt like a chain, locking the people of Boston into a system where they had no voice, no vote, and no control over the decisions that ruled their lives. No taxation without representation was more than a slogan. It was a desperate cry for dignity. Taverns buzzed with talk of resistance. Pamphlets passed from hand to hand, stirring anger and resolve. Men like Samuel Adams and John Hancock spoke passionately of liberty, while ordinary carpenters, dock workers, and shopkeepers wondered how long they could endure. For every coin they earned, a slice of it vanished into the coffers of a government. Thousands of miles away, a government that cared nothing for them. British soldiers patrolled the city, redcoats gleaming like warning signs against the gray winter sky. Officially, they were here to keep the peace. In truth, they were a daily reminder of who held the power. They weren't welcomed. Locals muttered that these soldiers were not protectors but enforcers, standing guard not for the colonists, but for the taxes and policies that drained them dry. At the markets, colonists scowled when soldiers walked by, musket straps over their shoulders. Mothers pulled their children closer. Workers clenched their jaws. Every red coat felt like an insult, a reminder that Boston was not free. The tension wasn't just political, it was personal. Soldiers often took part-time work to supplement their income, competing with local laborers for scarce jobs. This bred bitterness. Imagine a dock worker, strong hands rough from years of hauling rope, watching a British private take the day's wage that should have fed his family. Resentment smoldered like an ember that refused to die. And then there were the protests. They started small, meetings, speeches, angry words shouted at soldiers. But slowly, steadily, the gatherings grew louder, the voices more defiant. At night, lantern light flickered across faces filled with determination. They wanted to be heard. They wanted justice. They wanted freedom. Boston was a city on edge. Every street corner held the possibility of confrontation. Every march carried the risk of violence. The people of Boston weren't just protesting taxes. They were protesting what those taxes represented. Subjugation, disrespect, and the stripping away of their rights as Englishmen. The city was a powder keg, and the fuse had already been lit. By 1770, Boston was no longer a city at peace. It was a city divided. On one side stood the colonists, merchants, artisans, apprentices, laborers, angry and frustrated at every new tax and every fresh insult from Parliament. On the other stood the British soldiers, red-coated and stone-faced, ordered to keep order but finding themselves in a land where they were hated for the uniform they wore. The streets had become battlegrounds of words and stares. A soldier could not walk past a tavern without being mocked. A colonist could not sell his goods without remembering the tax stamped upon them by men across the ocean. The very air was tense, charged with something no one could quite name, but everyone could feel. It wasn't just the politics of the crown, it was the friction of daily life. Soldiers, young men often far from home, needed extra money to survive, so they took jobs unloading ships or working in shops. That meant fewer jobs for Bostonians already struggling to feed their families. Imagine being a dock worker, hands blistered and tired, only to see a soldier, someone sent here to control you, step in and take your day's wages. The bitterness was personal. On cold nights, groups of boys would hurl snowballs and insults at the soldiers stationed in town. "Lobsterbacks," they sneered, mocking the Redcoats as if they were foolish crustaceans. It started as childish defiance, but each insult chipped away at the fragile wall of civility. Soldiers returned the hostility with glares, sometimes with shoves. Fists were raised more than once. Crowds often gathered in the marketplace, and it didn't take much for an argument to turn into a scene. A merchant refusing to buy British goods, a soldier demanding respect, an apprentice shouting back, others joining in, voices rising like waves crashing against one another. Sometimes stones were thrown, sometimes clubs were raised. Boston wasn't simply noisy, it was on the brink. The presence of the British military was meant to intimidate, but, instead, it enraged. Every musket slung over a soldier's shoulder reminded the colonists that they were not trusted, not respected, and not free. The people of Boston whispered about tyranny, about oppression, about being treated not as citizens but as subjects to be ordered and silenced. Leaders like Samuel Adams seized the moment. Through fiery speeches and passionate writings, he urged colonists to resist, to see themselves not as helpless subjects, but as a people with the right to decide their own fate. "We are Englishmen," they declared, "and we demand the rights of Englishmen." The words spread like fire through taverns and gatherings, stirring anger and pride in equal measure. But with every speech, every pamphlet, every angry word hurled at a soldier, the tension thickened. The line between order and chaos grew thinner. Boston had become a city where every snowball could lead to blood, where every insult could spark a fight, where every argument carried the shadow of something darker. People knew it, but no one could stop it. The streets themselves seemed to hold their breath, waiting. Something was going to happen. Everyone knew it. The only question was when. March 5th, 1770. A cold Monday night in Boston. Snow fell in thick, wet clumps, coating the cobblestones and chilling the air with a sharp bite. People huddled in their cloaks as lantern light flickered through the streets. But this night would not pass quietly. It was the night when simmering anger would finally erupt. It began outside the Custom House, where British taxes were collected, a building already despised by the people. A lone sentry stood guard, his musket resting at his side, trying to keep warm against the winter air. A group of young men, apprentices, and laborers spotted him. They began to jeer. "Lobsterback! Redcoat!" Snowballs flew through the air, slamming into his uniform, some packed with stones and ice. The sentry shouted back, his voice swallowed by the crowd. He struck out with his bayonet, warning them to stay away. But the shouts only grew louder. Soon bells rang out through the streets. In Boston, bells usually meant fire, and men poured, out of taverns and homes, rushing toward the sound. But there was no fire that night, only anger. The crowd swelled. Dozens gathered, then hundreds, faces flushed with rage, voices chanting. Some carried clubs, others picked up rocks from the street. The lone soldier, now terrified, called for reinforcements. A squad of British soldiers marched in, their red coats bright against the snow, muskets gleaming in the lantern light. They formed a line, bayonets fixed, as the crowd pressed closer. Captain Thomas Preston arrived to take command, his voice stern but uneasy. He had not come for bloodshed. He had come to control chaos. The crowd, though, smelled fear. They pressed forward, shouting curses, daring the soldiers to fire. "You dare not shoot! You dare not shoot!" Men swung clubs, hurling sticks, ice, and oyster shells. One soldier staggered from a blow to the head, his musket slipping in his hands. The tension snapped. In the chaos, someone shouted, "Fire!" though no one would ever agree on who gave the order. A musket cracked, echoing like thunder through the square. Then another. Then another. In seconds, the night exploded with gunfire. The air filled with screams. Smoke drifted over the snow, mixing with the sharp scent of gunpowder. When the smoke cleared, bodies lay in the street. Crispus Attucks, a dock worker of African and native descent, was among the first to fall. His lifeless body sprawled on the cobblestones. 4 others lay dead or dying, blood soaking into the snow. The crowd that had roared with defiance moments before now wailed with shock and fury. Men rushed forward, lifting the wounded, crying out for justice. Women screamed. From the windows, the soldiers stood frozen, muskets still smoking, faces pale with horror at what they had done. Captain Preston knew at once that the world had changed. What had started as insults and snowballs had ended in blood. The city would not forget this night. Neither would the world. The Boston Massacre, as it would come to be known, was not just a tragedy. It was a spark, and sparks have a way of catching fire. Morning broke over Boston, but the snow on King Street was still stained with blood. Word of the killings spread like wildfire. By sunrise, the city was seething. Bells rang again, but this time not for fire, for justice. Men gathered in town, squares. Women whispered at market stalls, and children repeated the words their parents spoke in anger. Murder, butchery, massacre. Patriot leaders knew this moment was too powerful to ignore. Samuel Adams, already a master of words, called the event a deliberate slaughter. Handbills appeared, printed overnight, describing the victims as martyrs of liberty. Paul Revere engraved a dramatic image showing soldiers lined in order, firing on an unarmed crowd, a picture that would spread far beyond Boston, fueling outrage across the colonies. The word massacre burned into memory, impossible to forget. But not everyone saw it that way. Loyalists, colonists who still supported the crown, accused the Patriots of twisting the truth. They said the soldiers had been provoked, attacked, with clubs, ice, and rocks. What happened, they argued, was self-defense, not murder. They warned that men like Adams were exaggerating, spinning lies to turn honest people against Britain. The trial of Captain Preston and his men became the stage, where this battle played out. The soldiers faced charges of murder. If found guilty, they could hang. To many Bostonians, this seemed just. To Loyalists, it was proof that Patriots wanted vengeance, not justice. Ironically, the soldiers' defense came from a man who would one day be a revolutionary hero himself, John Adams. Though he despised standing against the people's fury, Adams believed the law must rise above passion. In the courtroom, he spoke with calm precision. Facts are stubborn things. He argued the soldiers had fired in panic, surrounded by a mob that threatened their lives. Could any man, he asked, stand with musket in hand, pelted with ice and stones, and not fear for his life? The jury listened. After weeks of testimony, they acquitted Captain Preston and most of his men. 2 were convicted of manslaughter, not murder, and branded on the thumb as punishment. For Patriots, this felt like betrayal. How could the blood of Crispus Attucks, Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, Samuel Maverick, and Patrick Carr be answered only with a mark on the skin? Was Colonial life worth so little in the eyes of the law? To Loyalists, the verdict was proof that reason had prevailed. To Patriots, it was proof that British justice was not justice at all. The divide in Boston grew sharper. Neighbors no longer trusted one another. Taverns buzzed with accusations. He's a Loyalist, he defended the soldiers. Families split, over loyalty to king or colony. The massacre had not only spilled blood, it had cracked the fragile unity of the city. Yet in that fracture, the Patriots saw opportunity. They told the story their way. They called it tyranny. They called it murder. They called it betrayal. And betrayal, once named, cannot be forgotten. The blood spilled on King Street did not wash away with the melting snow. It lingered, in memory, in whispers, in every tavern conversation, in every sermon from the pulpit. The Boston Massacre became more than an event. It became a symbol. Across the 13 colonies, news traveled fast. Riders carried broadsheets, pamphlets, and Paul Revere's engraving from town to town. In Philadelphia, New York, Charleston, and beyond, people stared at the image of redcoats firing into a helpless crowd. They read accounts of men shot down in the street, unarmed, guilty only of demanding dignity. Even those far from Boston felt the weight of the moment. If it could happen there, it could happen anywhere. The Crown had intended to keep Boston quiet, to remind the colonists of Britain's strength. Instead, the massacre did the opposite. It gave the Patriots proof of tyranny. Here, they said, was evidence that the king's soldiers would fire on his own subjects without hesitation. Here was proof that colonists were not treated as Englishmen, but as enemies to be subdued. Every year after, Bostonians held commemorations on March 5th. Bells tolled, processions marched, and fiery orators stood before crowds to remind them of the blood shed on their streets. They called it a lesson, a warning, a rallying cry. Men like Samuel Adams urged the people never to forget Crispus Attucks and the others who had died. They were not simply victims. They were martyrs, sacrificed, in the name of liberty. For the loyalists, it was maddening. They insisted the Patriots were twisting the truth, using fear to pull the colonies apart from Britain. But their words were drowned out by the growing chorus of resistance. Colonists who had once hesitated, who had once hoped for reconciliation, began to see the massacre as proof that reconciliation might be impossible. The event forged something new. Before, the colonies were divided, each concerned with its own problems: trade in New York, plantations in Virginia, ports in Charleston. But now, they had a shared story of oppression. The Boston Massacre became the thread that tied them together. One colony's pain became every colony's cause, and when 5 years later shots rang out at Lexington and Concord, many would look back to that snowy night in Boston and say, "It began there." That was the spark. That was when Americans first realized that freedom would not be given. It would have to be taken. The massacre's legacy was not only blood in the snow, but fire in the hearts of a people who refused to live on their knees. The names of the fallen echoed in every call to arms: Attucks, Gray, Caldwell, Maverick, Carr. Ordinary men who had become extraordinary symbols. In the end, the Boston Massacre was more than a tragedy. It was a turning point. A moment when a city's grief became a nation's anger, when victims became martyrs, and when scattered colonies began to dream of unity. A dream that, not long after, would be called the United States of America. The Boston Massacre was more than 5 deaths on a cold night. It was a warning carved in blood across the cobblestones of King Street. A reminder that freedom has a price, and that ordinary people, dock workers, apprentices, shopkeepers, could change the course of history. From grief came unity. From unity came rebellion. And from rebellion came a nation. The revolution did not begin with a declaration. It began with a massacre.